I've always been fascinated by the UK's Sonic the Comic, published by Fleetway. Growing up with the Archie comic, this one always felt kind of mysterious and foreign to me. Sharper than a cyber razor cut, whatever the fuck that means. I'm not British myself, but I do have some family who lives in England who would occasionally send me an issue or two, so I actually did have some limited exposure to it as a child. Well, I finally sat down and read the whole thing, and I have to say, I found the experience to be rather enjoyable. However, I may be slightly more predisposed to enjoy an old Sonic comic than your average person. Because I didn't really grow up with the comic, I can't give you the wistful, nostalgic retrospective this series deserves, but I can give you my impressions as a fully grown Yank reading a British children's comic for the first time. One thing that always stuck out to me is that the Fleetway comic is noticeably larger than the Archie comic. Maybe this is just like a British comic thing, but I gotta say, it's actually quite nice. I figured I'd mention it because it's something you might not appreciate if you're just reading scans of the series on your computer like some kind of social deviant. As far as the structure of the comic goes, issues are divided into 4 stories, the first of which is always about Sonic, but it also featured stories about other Sega games as well, like Shinobi, Golden Axe, Echo, etc. There were also some short magazine-like sections, including gaming-related news, reviews, cheats, and tips about various Sega games at the time. Look at this sick motherfucker who gave Bubsy an 88%. I gotta say, I really enjoyed looking back at these old news pages. Like, I've seen a lot of Sonic costumes over the years, but check out this Tails suit. God damn. These news pages are a pretty great source for high-quality pictures. So having 4 separate stories per issue is a pretty cool idea, but they can end up feeling fairly brief. The Sonic story is always 7 pages long, and the other stories are usually just 5 pages each, so stories are typically broken up into parts that span across multiple issues, although there were a fair amount of brief one-shot stories, especially early on in the series. And unlike the Archie comic, which came out on a monthly basis, Sonic the Comic was published fortnightly, so there was a new issue every 2 weeks. Anyways, if you try to read every issue sequentially, it can feel a bit disjointed. I personally find it helps to read the multi-part stories all at once. As the comic went on, these non-Sonic stories were eventually phased out, and instead of the last 3 segments focusing on other Sega games, they would typically feature other Sonic characters instead. While I love the idea in theory, to be perfectly honest, most of these character side stories usually weren't as interesting as the main story. Particularly Tails and his Nameless Zone stuff didn't really captivate me. Some of his Zone Runner stories were okay, but most of the time I found his solo adventures underwhelming. I did, however, enjoy the 2-parter where Tails receives hypnotherapy to become more cool. That one is a classic for sure. Likewise, I wasn't that into the later Amy and Techno stories. Amy's a somewhat different design in this comic. It kinda seems like her hair is based on a misinterpretation of this Sonic CD art, where her quills are standing up because of the way Sonic is carrying her. That said, I actually don't really have any issues with this look. It's not bad. Interestingly, her signature weapon is a crossbow, as this comic predates her Pico Pico hammer, which wouldn't debut until Sonic the Fighters. Speaking of weird design differences, I think this is the only portrayal of Knuckles where his little white Nike swoosh of chest fur is portrayed as an actual necklace. Knuckles is a pretty good character in the Fleetway comic, particularly when he's involved with the main story or serving as a foil for Sonic. But even some of his side stories ended up feeling pretty inconsequential and pointless. Again, some were okay, like this 4-parter where he's talking to dinosaur ghosts was pretty amusing. So what about Sonic himself? Well, he's a bit of a prick. I mean, maybe that's an oversimplification. I suppose it could be argued he just has a peculiar sense of humor. He's particularly mean to Tails, whom he's nicknamed Pixel Brain. I personally think all of this shit is hilarious. However, I can't understand why some people might be put off by it. That said, I totally dig this version of Sonic. He's vain, arrogant, rude, and even selfish at times, and these traits can and do get him into trouble. I mean, he's still ultimately portrayed as a good guy, of course, just a bit more of a flawed hero than usual, which is nice. I've always preferred a little more attitude and a little less power of friendship bullshit. Some portrayals seem to think having an attitude just means making a lot of bad jokes. As I explained in my previous video, the comic uses a version of the Kintobor origin story from the Sonic Bible drafted by Sega of America, which is also where it got the names for Porker Lewis and Johnny Lightfoot, who are both fairly prominent characters. They even end up using the name Sally Acorn too for a totally unimportant side character early on. In fact, Kintobor himself is even a reoccurring character in the form of an AI. The plot point of the Grey Emerald being a special control emerald also makes an appearance. Of course, they end up introducing plenty of brand new characters as well, like Techno, Short Fuse, Captain Plunder, but for this video I'm just going to focus on the characters people actually recognize. In my last video I mentioned that Robotnik changes his form to better match his Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog look in issue 22. However, I glossed over the fact he accomplishes this transformation by incubating and hatching from a gigantic egg, thus making this version of Robotnik the only literal Eggman as far as I'm aware. Robotnik also has an assistant, Grimer, who's basically the Fleetway version of Snively. In fact, the character was created because the writer, Nigel Kitching, was under the impression that he had to use Snively in the comic, but was informed it was actually the opposite. They couldn't use the character, so he was quickly rewritten into being a new character called Grimer instead. Something I thought was kind of neat was how in this comic Knack is introduced as a part of the Chaotix, before he would of course go on to betray them and become a minor recurring villain. The Chaotix themselves are portrayed as the guardians of the Special Zone, which is essentially an alternate universe in this comic. And for the most part they're pretty cool, except for Charmy, who they've gone out of their way to make as irritating as possible. As I've briefly discussed before, one of the most well-known differences of this comic is the way it handles Super Sonic. When Sonic is placed under an extreme amount of stress, he transforms into Super Sonic, who's portrayed as a wild-eyed psychotic killer that Sonic has no control over, and indeed he blacks out when he goes Super Sonic and can't remember what he does. At first the character is used very sparingly, till a story called Running Wild which culminates in Super Sonic splitting from Sonic and existing as his own separate entity, which Sonic and friends then have to deal with. It's a pretty unique take on the character, and they do some interesting things with him. Unfortunately, right when it seems like we're gonna get the awesome final showdown between Sonic and Super Sonic, he suddenly loses his powers and gets amnesia, and ends up faffing about not doing much for most of the last half of the series. It's unfortunate, but in terms of power creep, the character was so unreasonably powerful that it was just starting to interfere with the story, I guess. Another very popular villain from the comic is Metal Sonic, known in this series as Metallix. He first appeared in a Sonic CD-inspired storyline, where he ends up getting defeated due to some questionable time travel shenanigans. Another version based on Mecha Sonic appears during the loose Sonic 3 Knuckles adaptation, which establishes Metallix as an elite unit of Metal Sonics. This becomes a key plot point during the Brotherhood of Metallix arc, which is often considered a high point in the series. So obviously the comic had a number of artists and writers over the course of its run, some of which were significantly more talented than others. While eventually the series would develop a more clean and consistent look, some of the very early issues featured stunningly bad artwork. Like, check out this story from issue 5 with some truly atrocious art. This story was actually written by Mark Miller. Years before he would write Kick-Ass or Marvel's Civil War, he was writing stories about Tails getting kidnapped by Bacon, and other extremely peculiar Sonic stories. Although he was the first regular contributor, he departed from the series early on, and this gave way to Nigel Kitching becoming the first lead writer. When people fondly remember this comic, there's a very good chance they're thinking of a story written by Nigel Kitching and illustrated by Richard Elson. These stories are pretty much what you'd call the good shit. I really dig Elson's art, and it was cool seeing the progression from his early work, watching it slowly coalesce into the definitive STC look. I wasn't quite so keen on some of the other artists though. Like, I do think Mick McMahon is a talented artist, but I really did not like the way he drew Sonic characters. Not unlike the Archie comic, the early strips were mostly just inconsequential fucking around, but in issue 9 Sonic is sent 6 months into the future, and during his absence Robotnik takes over the world, and remains in control of Mobius all the way until issue 100. Wow, Robotnik taking over the planet after Sonic is gone for 6 months. What an interesting idea. Something that stuck out to me when reading this comic is that it felt a little more in tune with the games than the early Archie comic or any of the cartoons of the era. Sonic actually lives in Green Hill Zone and later Emerald Hill Zone, Robotnik's base is in Metropolis Zone, and many other zones from the games like Chemical Plant were featured as well. The events of the first 2 games were also considered canon to the comic. While later in the run it would start focusing much more on its own original characters and locations, I feel like it struck a good balance early on. You know, I thought this comic was only released in the UK, but apparently there were versions of it published in other countries. These publications seemingly leaned even harder on the magazine aspect, and were much more short-lived. Something kind of interesting is that from October 1993 to April 1995, there was a Sonic the Hedgehog Sunday strip that ran in a British newspaper called the News of the World. Although the strip wasn't officially related to the Fleetway comics, they did run concurrently, and there were some parallels. It even changed its Robotnik design the same week as the comic. And despite being printed with absolutely no credits, it was eventually confirmed that Richard Elson did a majority of the art for the strip. Unfortunately, the way the comic ended was some serious bullshit. Starting with issue 133, one of the 4 strips per issue was used to reprint previous stories. This was done to save money obviously, but also as part of Egmont Fleetway's policy of 5-year reader cycles apparently. The number of pages was also cut from 36 to 32, which resulted in them cutting out the sections on news, reviews, and tips, and later in the year the comic's mascot Megadroid was removed. By issue 158, there was just one new Sonic story per issue, with the rest being reprints. This coincided with the Shanazar and Time Zone story arcs, which meant that the comic didn't take place on Mobius or feature any main characters except for Sonic, and later on Amy, for an extended period of time. Nigel Kitching was also fired, leaving Lou Stringer as the sole writer. Although Kitching would return to write a 10-part adaptation of Sonic Adventure, which was well received, this would ultimately be the last new material written for the comic, and starting with issue 185, the entire comic was comprised of reprints, till it was finally cancelled after issue 223. Richard Elson was the only member of the creative staff left during this period, and his only job was to draw new covers for each issue. So it's a bummer the comic ended up getting cancelled under such shitty circumstances, with executive meddling and budget cuts ultimately leading to its demise, but it left a very strong impression on a lot of fans. In fact, there's even an unofficial fan continuation of the series called Sonic the Comic Online, which has received praise from Kitching and occasional contributions from former STC staff like Richard Elson. Anyways, there's still a lot of stuff I didn't talk about yet. I just wanted to make a video taking a broad look at the comic before going over the minutiae of the series. I guess I also wanted to make this video as a way to gauge people's interest on the subject, but I think it might be fun to go through and break down some of the major arcs and weirder stories if people are interested. And I also wouldn't mind talking to some actual Brits who are more knowledgeable about the comic than I am. And if you have any Fleetway Sonic memories yourself, feel free to share them in the comments below.